So good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me. My name is Scott Hicks. I'll be moderating this webinar led by Terry Locklear, instructional designer in our Office of Online Learning. He and his colleagues there have been very busy transitioning, I think, about 1,800 courses from face-to-face to remote delivery. And I'm glad that he can join us today as he talks about fostering rich discussion in online classes. So research demonstrates that well-elaborated and thought-provoking discussions can make the difference in online classes. It not only fosters active learning, but also contributes to building a strong sense of community. So for this reason, the Office of Online Learning and TLC are presenting today this webinar about creating effective discussions in online courses. Besides exploring the technical discussion options in Canvas, this session will also include strategies to increase student participation, engagement, and sense of belonging in an online course. Our presenter again is Terry Locklear, instructional designer. And as moderator, I'll be watching the chat and helping to facilitate the conversation at the end of his presentation today. We're recording it so that it can be posted to our YouTube channel tomorrow. We're grateful to Online Learning for hosting it. And I'm going to turn the webinar over to Terry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hicks. And this is Terry Locklear from the Office of Online Learning. I'm the instructional designer here on campus. And I'm happy to present this along with Dr. Hicks, and I thank him for helping us put this all together. So our goals for this session are to identify some just-in-time strategies for creating engaging discussions while building a sense of community in an online course. And we want to also share successes that others may adopt or adapt in their own courses. And we want to resolve, maybe through collaboration, the problems that others may be experiencing. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we feel better about the opportunity to create rich discussion topics and our abilities to encourage student participation and to create that sense of belonging as well. So in terms of administering online discussions, you may wish to consider the following from the outset. You may want to create a question and answer forum from the beginning to kind of mitigate the number of emails that you receive from students. So you might want to encourage students to send, rather than sending you emails directly, create a Q&A forum in the discussion area to have students send questions there, and sometimes other students can answer those and you can respond, and other students can see the questions as well. They may have the same ones, so it may minimize the number of responses back and forth. You're going to want to stick to some type of schedule. It's always a good rule of thumb in online discussions to have a schedule in terms of you may want to say for the duration of the semester, initial replies are always going to be due on Monday or Wednesday, and then your response posts are always going to be due the following Saturday or Sunday or whatever, just so students can get in a routine and create a routine, because we can assume that they're dealing with all types of issues during this interesting time. You're going to want to make sure that your discussions align with some type of objectives, and that alignment is a strategy that we learn through Quality Matters. Another option for creating discussions is also maybe consider using reflections instead of just asking a discussion question or creating a discussion post that's going to be interaction heavy. You may want to have reflections where students reflect about the chapter, the previous chapter, or the previous lesson, and discuss what they learned or how it made them connect with whatever's going on, maybe in other courses or just in their lives in general. So I just added this next bullet: to reply or not to reply. That is the question. And when we think about reflections, you may want to have a reflection where just students can read others. You may or may not encourage students to reply to those. The way in which you create these discussions and how you want students to participate and to what level is definitely going to vary. And it may be a question of, you can also have the option of um, forcing students to post before they can see other posts. That's always something that professors grapple with as well. Depending on the subject area, I always encourage faculty members to use that option because there are some students that may read other posts and kind of create their post as a summary of all the other ones rather than coming up with their own original thoughts. So some just-in-time strategies here. Continued. You may want to, this is a liberal arts institution, and one of our major goals is to educate students. We're not here to train students, and education is definitely not equal to training. So we want students that when they graduate from here, they have a rich liberal arts degree, and they're critical thinkers. So one of the ways in which we can encourage critical thinking are through these discussion boards. And I got this definition of a liberal arts institution from Minnesota State. So it refers to colleges, college studies that provide general knowledge and develop intellectual ability, and that's exactly what we can do um, through these online discussions. So, for online discussions, I think that the Socratic um, method of questioning works well. R.W. Paul is an author that categorized the Socratic questioning method into 9 categories. So there's questions of clarification, questions that probe purpose, assumptions, information reasoning, evidence and causes, questions about viewpoints and perspective, implications and consequences, questions about the question. There's questions that probe concepts, and there's questions that can run inference and interpretations. So um, here's some examples of these categories of questions, and keep in mind the difference between an initial prompt versus an instructor reply. So an initial prompt, that's going to be something that's going to be a question or a discussion prompt for the entire class, and instructor replies are going to be directed toward individual students. So you may have some questions of clarifications. So here are some examples of those. Can you give me an example of A, B, C, D? Can you explain that further? Expand on the idea that. So here's some questions of purpose. So what was the purpose of such and such? What did you mean when you said? So that would be an example of a instructor reply to a particular student. How do the purposes of these two groups vary? So that's a way in which we can foster some critical thinking as well. Assumptions. So what could we assume instead of assuming such and such? How can we verify, or how can we prove or disprove the assumption that? Is it always clear that? So here's some questions that prompts that probe information, reasoning, evidence, and causes. What would be an example of? How do you know that? Or what information leads us to believe that? Viewpoints and perspectives. Here's a way in which we can really get specific to that we could get some interesting responses from various students on their specific viewpoints or perspectives based on the information that's been presented. What would someone say who disagrees about this? Or what is an alternative to this? What's the advantages and disadvantages of? Probing implications and consequences. If this and that are the case, then what else must be true? If that happened, what else would also have to happen as a result, and why? Or how does X connect with what we've learned before? Questions about the question. What do you think? What do you think of when I asked for a candid response to this question? Does this evaluate? Does this ask us to evaluate something? And what facts do we need before we can answer this? Some questions that probe concepts. What's the main idea that we're dealing with here? How or why is this idea important? Do these two ideas conflict? And if so, how? Last one here, um, inferences and interpretations. What conclusions are we coming about? Is there a more logical inference we can make in this situation? And how do you interpret this behavior? In what ways could others interpret this behavior as well? So three things I want you to think of while we while we're going through this exercise is participate, engage, and encourage. Drop in. Your participation is valued, I'm sure, by students, and dropping in doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to want to respond to each student each week. Don't let it become overwhelming because it can certainly do so. You're going to want to engage with students, but I would encourage to make sure that I would encourage you to be sure that your responses and your engagement is has some sort of even distribution. Try to avoid responding to the same students, no matter same students over and over again, no matter how good their responses are. There are some students that participate in discussions, and I'm sure that some are going to be better than others in their responses, and you're going to want to respond to them, you know. But at the same time, we need to make sure that our responses are evenly distributed. Encourage. Remember that that during discussions, there's no visual or social cues. Students can't see you, so your words are really going to matter. You're going to have to be careful how you use words, and you don't want to come across as harsh or brash. So I think it's important to build a sense of community in online classes. Um, and here are a couple of ways that we can do it, and a couple of things that I want you to that I want you to keep in mind. Goodfellow and Hewling, 2005, wrote an article. They conducted a study, and they concurred or they agreed that two themes emerged from online interactions or interactions in online courses. Inequities can arise from the dominant values embodied in teaching materials and methods. So you've got the teaching materials, and then number two is there's a potential for miscommunication among participants during online interactions, and that can arise from cultural differences. So consider your teaching materials and the way in which interactions are made. Because, going back to the idea that there's no social cues, that can, these two things can really hinder that idea of building a sense of community. So while we consider while we consider this, I'm not sure why those arrows just disappeared, but while we're thinking of this, I want you to think about our student population. And on the left here, we've got the typical idea of the way in which we educate, and what we're trying to do through while building social presence and encouraging community is we want to shift from what's on the left to what's on the right. So instead of like this idea of dominant persistence, we want to move more toward justice. And instead of isolation, where students feel isolated, we want to move more toward inclusion. And we want to move from division to connectedness. So while building a sense of community in online courses, just think of how the areas on the left differentiate from the areas on the right, which is where we want to be. So at this time, I want to just pause and just have a conversation, and I want others to maybe share some successes that they've found through online collaborations, and in doing so, others may want to adopt those good ideas, and we want to resolve through collaboration some problems or challenges that some may be experiencing. So this time, I'm going to just pause here, and if anybody has wants to make some comments uh, about how they foster online interactions or foster communication and discussions in their online courses, I'm happy to hear those.
If you have questions as well, you can share them to the chat box. I want to start with one of the questions perhaps that came up while you were presenting, Terry. This was a question about making sure we communicate with both sections or multiple sections of a class in Canvas. What are your thoughts about combining the same sections of the same course into a single shell in Canvas and then allowing the discussion boards to take place with more students?
I think that's a good idea. Um, but for classes that were initially online from the beginning of the semester, I think that's always a good idea, depending on the discipline. But at the same time, you may want to, if I were going to if I were going to combine a class, it would say 25 in one and 25 in another, and so you have 50 students. For when I would encourage um, creating groups and letting maybe groups, smaller groups, and having discussions every week. So where students would maybe be participating in a different or discussing the topics with a different set of students each week. I think that can be valuable, depending on the subject area. But I think it may be challenging for face-to-face classes that were converted to online to combine the sections simply because of like if you were having synchronous classes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for one section versus Tuesdays and Thursdays, different times may create some confusion.
I like your point about creating groups within Canvas. I think that's a great approach. And it helps in a way students to have a manageable set of others that they can then communicate with.
Because I think if there's even if it's 25 or 30, it can become overwhelming for students. So
I
I
agree.
think it's a good idea to break groups down or create smaller groups for discussions. I think that can students are more likely to participate in that way.
Another question that came up is, can you share different methods of grading the discussions? As I think about that question, I sort of am reminded of your slides where you gave us different stems for different kinds of questions. So what are your thoughts about how to grade or different methods for grading those kinds of discussions?
Well, and you want to think about the difference between quantity versus quality. I like the idea of limiting words. So instead of saying, I just have this open-ended discussion, and some students can just write a whole, write one page or 1,000 words and not really say anything. I like the idea of limiting to maybe 250 words max or 200 words max, and making sure that students can really get to their point and be concise. Um, and then it makes it easier to grade, but at the same time, it forces students to really think critically. And I do think I do think discussion should be graded in order to and of course, encourage that participation. But at the same time, you may want to think about using rubrics when you're grading discussions. It's a good rule of thumb, I think, to include those rubrics, and then students will know the expectations from the outset.
I've had good experience with rubrics, which helps me sort of go through them easily. And I think, as you know too, it's about quality. If I'm using a rubric, I can pay more attention to the quality, I think, than the quantity of what they've said. So I appreciate
Absolutely.
that point about rubrics. Have you ever experimented with letting students grade one another?
I think that's a good rule of thumb in graduate courses sometimes, but at the undergraduate level, it depends on maybe it depends on the course. But I think I would be careful about relying too heavily on that. It just depends on the group of students that you're dealing with, I guess. I don't have a lot of experience personally at the undergraduate level on allowing students to grade other students. Maybe if it was completely anonymous, which of course I'm sure it would be. Um, what are some other thoughts about that question?
While people are thinking about that, I'm going to put another question onto the table. One of the listeners asks, says that they've used rubrics before, replies and rubrics. What other tricks might you suggest in terms of assessing them? And what's a good way to create flow in the discussions? How can we help students connect what it is that they are thinking themselves with what their peers can contribute as well?
I think it kind of goes back to that Socratic means of questioning. You know, in terms of creating flow, you're not going to want to ask a question that could potentially lead students to all have the same answer. You don't want to ask questions that are going to be um, like real factual, like for example, what color is the sky or whatever. You're going to want to ask a question. You're going to want to ask it in such a way that you're gonna get 20. If you got 20 students, you're going to get 20 completely different answers. So a way in my mind, a way in which to encourage flow is by ensuring that you're getting that the objective is being met. Students are connecting with the content, but also you're going to get a wide array of correct or responses that are on target or in line with what you would what you were expecting.
I like a person here added to the chat. Can I teach the students in the course how to question each other somehow? I think that's a great way to understand too what questions students might have. I've often struggled with discussion boards to have very open-ended or broad questions or prompts, or having very specific prompts. I'm not quite sure that I've figured out which one is best, but I like this idea of letting students come up with the questions. I think it'd give me a good sense of how they're responding to the work.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe if it was, maybe, sometimes if you're having a discussion about something students have read, um, you tend to, it's easy to ask a question you know, that would generate responses that are very similar. So if you allow students to create those, I think it would be interesting to see what comes out of it.
I
You could
agree.
have a discussion, something like going back to that Socratic means of questioning. If somebody wanted to learn how to X, or how could we use this content to lead somebody to XYZ or whatever.
Well, that leads to another comment. A person writes, I've worked very closely with you in creating online courses, discussions, and rubrics work because there is a grade associated with them, but I don't see the passion of the participants. So how do we get, and I know we've experienced this in face-to-face classes, online as well, how can we get our Socratic style questions to generate passion, interest, energy?
hmm I think sometimes it depends on the subject area, but but in particular with like general ed courses, so you're trying to you're trying to encourage students um, to be excited or to be interested in something that they may not necessarily be interested in. They're taking these general ed courses, sometimes just because it's a requirement. Their major may be something completely different, and they may be in there thinking, I'm just trying to check the box here. So I think it's tough to generate rich discussion in situations like that, especially if it's in like uh, the sciences or like business or something that's going to that's prone to um, more objective type of discussion, black and white. So I think that's a challenge.
I think case studies might help here, especially given the questions you've shown us, the question stems. To imagine a case in our disciplines, and as you note, general education is different than the upper level or graduate level courses. But if we can create a situation that might be relevant to students' lives in some way, where they can see its relevance to their continued success in college, I wonder if that's a good way to approach those discussion prompts that engage interest. I guess
I agree. Hmm
Flip side of that question, I think, is, and you sort of told us to differentiate here, how can our instructor replies create or foster that passion we want to see in students?
Mhm. And it depends on, like, if that discussions are typically, they typically last for like a week, or maybe 2 weeks at the most, on one prompt, and with that Socratic means of questioning, it just seems like that can go on for forever. So we've got to deal with a couple of constraints here, but I do like the idea of, going back to creating that sense of community. If the instructor responds, to a specific student, having that all out in the open and responding in such a way that they're probing, to really get to what, encourage the student, or probing in such a way that the content is going to connect to them and make it relevant to them. Because at the end of the day, I think students are going to be asking, what's in it for me? Of course, that's always going to come up, other than I'm just trying to check a box and get through. If you can connect it to something like what Dr. Hicks said, how can this help me in college? Or how can this help, for the next level? I think they would be more apt to more actively engage.
I think reflection is key as well. If you get students thinking about what it is they know or don't know, and when they begin to assess what it is they want to know, I think students then begin to develop some of that internal motivation we want them to see. I think it's also I think it's also an indication as to the kind of community you've created if students are willing to be reflective on their discussion boards and share their ideas with others. I think that's sort of what we're aiming for.
Exactly. And going back to what we were talking about earlier with the non-visual cues and the use of words, I think it's students are going to be more encouraged when we choose our words carefully, rather than you've got to do this, or this is a requirement. Of course, the requirement, that's going to be in there and implied, but using words that encourage participation, like, let's discuss a time in which, or an example of, rather than being kind of top down, with your prompts.
And language can be as simple as, rather than saying submit a response, share a response.
Exactly.
What other questions does the group have? Or what other ways had they found it to be successful? In what ways have you used discussion boards that have been helpful or energetic or enriching in your classes?
I would love to hear somebody from, one of the faculty members, particularly from, like, from the sciences, or maybe from business, if they're on the call.
Hey, this is Bob. I'm kind of listening to this and hoping to check out the recorded version of it afterwards. But my experience with discussion boards has been so far, and I'm using it in a bunch of my courses, especially for students who are watching recorded lectures rather than watching them live, that it's really, really hard for me to keep up with, um, just to manage it. I mean, it seems to take hours for me to figure out which students have responded, which ones have responded to other students' questions, and if that's already been addressed, I apologize. I've been kind of in and out, and I was hoping to watch it recorded. But is that something you've talked about already? How do you keep track of student responses and responses to existing discussions?
That's something that we can definitely chat about later. I'll reach out to you, and we'll talk about those aspects for sure. Grading can be, it can be tough, grading discussions depending on the requirement. I'm happy to provide some tips that may make it a little bit more manageable.
I want to speak to another post to the chat. The person writes, the best discussion boards are the ones in which I can summarize class responses and then use them for the next one. The key is keeping the discussion moving somehow and creating a habit of response.
Yeah, that's a good point about keeping the discussion going.
So someone else posts a handout on how to grade them would be handy. What would the group here think should be on such a handout?
Should it be completely technical, or should it be more about like tips and tricks?
Well, I think for me, the technical side of it would be useful. I think if I go back and listen to this recorded video, I'll be able to figure out some ideas about what to discuss. But for me, it's just a question of my time management and figuring out, well, when do I need to, at this time, I need to spend, 45 minutes working on, the aspects of the discussion board that I've assigned, and then I can, potentially not look at it until Thursday when I need to assign the new discussion board and those kinds of things. And all that I think is just getting used to online teaching, which I've never done before.
Mhm.
Welcome aboard.
Ahoy.
I know.
Are discussions something that's going back to Bob? Do you typically foster discussions in your face-to-face courses?
Yes, and usually there are a couple of students who are pretty vocal, and then I'll break the class up into smaller groups once the conversation has gotten started and say, take a minute and discuss, what we just talked about as a group, and see what you can add to it. But it just seems so disjointed, not being able to flow naturally from a comment or a statement or a question or a concern directly into having students engage while that knowledge is still fresh. Kind of picking it up cold seems really, really unnatural.
Yeah, and even from the outset, when we're creating discussion forums, we've got to keep in mind that this discussion is going to last over a period of time. It's not going to be synchronous. It's going to be kind of disjointed from the beginning. So how can we keep that flow going with that understanding? That's definitely a challenge, and I think it certainly varies by discipline.
Hey, Terry,
Go ahead.
Maria Pereira here. I wanted to pitch in with this thought. I do weekly check-in surveys with my class. It's only 15 students. It's easy. And I continuously ask their opinion. And so overall, what I got is this in the sciences. When we discuss things in class, we enjoy, or I enjoy, they saying. I see the instructor opinion, I see my colleague's opinion, I love it. You put me in an online setting, and I have no interest in participating.
I think I would go back to what Bob said as well, this feeling of natural or unnatural. We are expecting students to move in many cases from face to face to online. I think the discussions, I think they unfold differently when it's a fully online beginning to end class versus what we're experiencing now. I do understand completely that feeling of sort of being adrift or not connecting as much. So thanks for sharing that, Maria.
Yeah, I'm happy to put together some sort of a handout, and I'll try to provide some examples of questions that may or of prompts that may be useful for various disciplines, as well as the technical side of like using the speed grader and maybe breaking students into groups and that sort of thing.
As we talk about grading, what are your thoughts about grading for high stakes assignments in terms of discussions, or discussions being low stakes assignments? Do you think
That,
discussions can be
I
high
think that,
stakes
I'm
assignments?
sorry, go ahead.
Do you think that discussions can be counted as high stakes assignments? Or do you think they're best as low stakes assignments?
I think that it depends on how much discussion usually, thinking about where we are now and transitioning those face-to-face classes to online, thinking about what weight would you typically put on it in a face-to-face environment? For those in particular, I think it's important to sort of because we've got to remember that for those courses that have had to make this transition, the students didn't sign up for they didn't sign up for online classes, So this is not something they asked for. It's not something that we asked for either. But at the same time, I don't think we should. I don't think we should put more weight on the online aspects. If we're not going to, we should keep a similar style or a similar way of assessing students that we would have typically in the face-to-face environment, especially for those that have had the transition.
For those that have undergone that transition to remote learning, as consistent as possible as we continue. That's a good point.
And I think that's the only way to mitigate the toughness of the situation is to keep in line what we had going before.
I like one of the suggestions here on the chat. The discussion can come before the assignment, which is what the individual is doing to help them with the assignment. I can imagine that putting the discussion before the assignment helps you get the students to think critically about the material, about the activity, and then helps them, I think, probably explore what it is you want them to explore more deeply. So thanks for sharing that.
That's interesting, and I wonder what would happen if we created a discussion before a topic and say what are your before studying this, what are your initial assumptions about this subject, or what do you think you know about such and such, or what do you expect to learn? I think that would be an interesting discussion as well.
I think the benefit of discussion boards for faculty is that we get more of a sense of what all of our students are thinking. So in class, we might not know beyond what a couple who say something in class are thinking at a given time, but discussion boards that are graded, as we've discussed, gets everyone involved, and then we can learn what it is they know or don't know or understand or don't understand.
Exactly. It's like somebody's sharing their screen.
I'm thinking of, I have quite a few students who've missed assignments, and I may try to do some kind of a makeup assignment where they, if they've missed classes or missed assignments, have them do some kind of start a discussion about what they think the point of that assignment might have been, or what are some other assignments that they could see. Have them think about where that piece of material that they missed fits into the course or something along those lines, and maybe put several students who have to do a makeup in one group and have them discuss it for a while. Does that sound viable?
Absolutely. I think that's a good idea.
I like that it gets students to reflect on what they've learned or not learned. I think reflection is always a good thing.
What are some areas that you're still unclear about, sort of thing?
I also like the idea of having students work in groups. I know that Canvas makes that really easy. One of the things that's helped me and my students as we transitioned online has been that they've continued to work in the groups they were working with. I think having those groups of others to rely on, I think has been important. So as much as you can help them form groups, I think that's wonderfully helpful.
Scott, I have a question about that.
Go ahead.
How do you use Canvas to assign group work. The way I've done it is I've made like Google Docs and then assigned the groups and had them go and contribute to like a shared Google Doc, but I haven't really done it within Canvas.
So Crystal, I've also used Google Docs. And what I found to work really well is to have the students build a Google site that they then share with me and the members of their group. And they're then able to work together on editing, proofreading, sharing ideas, Google Meet, and various technologies. I've also used Canvas to set up the peer review feature. I think someone in the chat box has noted that that's been helpful. You can also, with assignments in Canvas, set them up so that they're to be completed by a group. You can actually create groups in Canvas and then use those for the submission of assignments. But really,
Okay.
I've found Google Sites to be most helpful, especially when it comes to students composing their essays and then sharing with each other their sources, because they can use the Google site as an archive, and they can also share their documents and presentations with one another and get feedback.
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to share with the group what I've been using my Google Doc group assignment for because I think it's working pretty nicely.
Please do.
Um, I always post the learning objectives for each chapter, and I find that the students ignore them wholly and then email me and ask me what's on the exam or what they should study, um, which is entirely exasperating to me. So what I've done is I've assigned them to groups and assigned each group a certain number of learning objectives, and then they are to within the group decide who's going to do what, answer which learning objective. They fill out the Google Doc, and then I like collate everything and put it together as a quote unquote study guide for the whole class. So they seem to be invested in doing that assignment because they're getting something out of it.
I think that's a wonderful idea. And I could almost see using the discussion boards as a way for students to peer review and get feedback about what it is they've done with those learning objectives. That's a really neat idea.
And going back to what Bob said earlier, about the workload, I think effective use of group work and discussion boards can in some ways take or reduce the workload, of the professor when used strategically.
So to build off of what you're saying and Crystal has said, the discussion boards become the space where the assignment is created, and then what you're actually grading or assessing is the final product. I do think that helps with grading.
Sure, like the workbench.
Are there other questions or anything that we've missed on the chat? So Terry, as you wrap up, what would you want us to remember or take away from this webinar today?
I would I think the sense of community is important, and sometimes it gets kind of put on the back burner. The sense of community and the use of words, just like the suggestion you had earlier, I think that's really important. I think the content is gonna come. The goals and the objectives of the course are going to be met, but at the end of the day, I would like students to uh, I do think that in the future, soft skills are going to be super important. And going back to the idea of a liberal arts institution and critical thinking, we've really got to uh, remember how to foster those soft skills in our students. And I think that is university wide and not necessarily discipline specific. I think discussions are a good way to work with students to develop these skills because Just like right now, we're all kind of forced to be in this digital world, and you're missing a lot of the visual cues. So I think that a good rule of thumb and a good way in which those skills can be developed are through discussion boards.
It's all about having that sort of human conversation, that dialogue that we learn from others.
Absolutely.
If there are no other questions, I'll go ahead and thank Terry for his time today. I know that I've learned a lot. I hope you have too. If you have any further questions, please let us know. We'll be happy to share those responses.
Thank you so much, and I will be working on that handout.
Thank you so much for doing that.
So thank you.
So again, thanks for joining us today. If you'd like to see the recording of this webinar, it will be posted to Online Learning's YouTube page tomorrow. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll be in touch with any answers that we can give you. Take care, everybody.